Hello, and welcome to the season finale of the Egyptophile podcast. In this episode, we will be diving into the infamous, mysterious, and intelligent Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of the Ptolemaic dynasty. I'll be honest with you, friends, I will be trying to keep this as unbiased as possible, but Cleopatra VII has been my absolute favorite pharaoh for much of my life. Because of this, I will be attempting to tell her actual story, not the one that Rome wrote for her to portray her as something that she was not. You may be asking, wait, Rome wrote her legacy? And to answer this, we will have to look into not only how her relationship with Rome started, but the effects Rome's relationship with Egypt had on her reign. So, grab a snack and some hydration because this episode will probably be one of the longest episodes of the podcast. Born in either early 69 BCE or late 70 BCE, Cleopatra VII is believed to be either the second eldest daughter or the middle child of Ptolemy XII. Her mother is uncertain. Many scholars believe that her mother may have been Ptolemy's wife, Cleopatra V Tryphena. However, Cleopatra V disappears from records only a few months after Cleopatra VII's birth. Cleopatra VII would be tutored by Philostratos, and while her first language was Koine Greek, she is the only Ptolemaic pharaoh to have learned to speak native Egyptian amongst other languages. When Cleopatra was either 4 or 5 years old, a Roman censor named Marcus Licinius Crassus argued to the Roman Senate that Rome needed to annex Egypt. However, his bill and a bill of tribune Servilis Rulis was rejected. This threat of annexation, however, caused Ptolemy XII to respond by offering remuneration and lavish gifts to powerful Roman statesmen like Pompey and eventually Julius Caesar before Caesar became Roman consul in 59 BCE. This prolific behavior bankrupted Ptolemy and resulted in him needing to acquire loans from Roman banker Gaius Rabirius Postumus. When Rome annexed Cyprus in 58 BCE, there were accusations that Ptolemy XII's brother, Ptolemy of Cyprus, was committing piracy. This drove Ptolemy of Cyprus to commit suicide instead of living in exile on Paphos. Ptolemy XII was publicly silent on the death of his brother, which damaged his credibility with his subjects and resulted in him being exiled from Egypt by force, taking a young Cleopatra VII with him. Ptolemy XII and Cleopatra would travel to Rhodes, Athens, and finally be in exile at Pompey's villa in Alban Hills near Parisene, Italy. An around 11-year-old Cleopatra and her father would spend about a year on Rome's outskirts. During this time, her sister, Bernice IV, sent an embassy to Rome advocating for her rule and opposing the reinstatement of Ptolemy XII. Ptolemy would have assassins kill the leaders of this embassy, an incident that his powerful Roman supporters covered up. Rome's Senate, however, would deny Ptolemy XII the offer of an armed escort and provisions for a safe return to Egypt, which resulted in him leaving Rome in late 57 BCE to reside at the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus. Ptolemy's Roman financiers were still determined to restore him to power, though. This resulted in Pompey persuading Aulus Gabinius, Syria's Roman emperor, to invade Egypt and restore Ptolemy XII to the throne, with an offer of 10,000 talents for this proposed mission. This put Gabinius at odds with Rome and its law, but he would invade Egypt in spring 55 BCE via Hasmonean, Judea. A young Mark Antony would be under Gabinius's command, where he would distinguish himself by preventing Ptolemy XII from massacring Pelusian's inhabitants and even rescuing the body of Bernice IV's husband, Archelaus, after he was killed in battle, which ensured Archelaus's right to a proper royal burial. Around 14 years old at the time, Cleopatra would travel with this Roman expedition into Egypt, and years later, Antony would profess that he had fallen in love with her during this period. Ptolemy XII and Cleopatra's return to Egypt would occur anywhere between January 55 BCE or June 55 BCE. Upon their return, Ptolemy XII would have his daughter Bernice and her supporters executed and seize their properties. To ensure he kept his power, Ptolemy would allow the Gebiani, which were Roman mercenaries and soldiers, to harass Alexandria's people in the streets and install his longtime supporter, Rabirius, as his chief financial officer. By May 31st, 52 BCE, Ptolemy would name Cleopatra as his regent and make a will which named her and her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, as his heirs. Almost a year later, Ptolemy XII would die, and the infamous Cleopatra would ascend the throne with her brother. Cleopatra's first act as queen would be to install a new sacred Bucus bull in Hermonthis near Thebes. However, she faced an immense number of issues and emergencies upon her ascension. Not only was there a drought that caused famine due to the Nile having low-level annual flooding, but her father's Gebiani were instigating lawless behavior. She also inherited her father's debt, which meant that now she owed Rome an estimated 17.5 million drachma. To solve the Gabiani issue, Syria's proconsul Marcus Calpurnius Biblius tried to send his two eldest sons to negotiate with and possibly recruit the Gabiani in 50 BCE. However, the Gabiani would torture and murder them, which resulted in Cleopatra sending the guilty Gabiani culprits to Bulbus as prisoners. Bulbus sent them back, however, and chastised Cleopatra for interfering with the prerogative of the Roman Senate. By August 29th, 51 BCE, Cleopatra would start listing herself as sole ruler on official documents, which shows evidence that she had rejected her brother Ptolemy XIII as her co-ruler. Interestingly, there is no evidence that she partook in the long-held Egyptian practice of marrying her brothers. Regardless, even though she had rejected her brother, Ptolemy held powerful allies. His most notable ally being the eunuch Pothinus, who was Ptolemy's childhood tutor, regent, and administrator of his properties. It is believed that Pothinus used his influence over the young Ptolemy to turn him against Cleopatra, which led to a civil war. Cleopatra, however, tried to attempt a short-lived alliance with her youngest brother, Ptolemy XIV, but by autumn 50 BCE, Ptolemy XIII had the upper hand in their conflict, and even signed documents with his name before his sisters. This resulted in the establishment of his first regnal date to be in 49 BCE. Cleopatra and her forces were still fighting against her eldest younger brother in the summer of 49 BCE, when Gnaeus Pompeius, son of Pompey, arrived to seek military aid on his father's behalf. Surprisingly, in what seems to have been their last joint decree, both Ptolemy and Cleopatra agreed to Pompeius's request and sent Pompey 60 ships and 500 troops, which included the Gabiani. This move would help erase some of their debt to Rome. However, Cleopatra would lose the fight against Ptolemy XIII and was forced to flee Alexandria for a region in Thebes. By spring 48 BCE, Cleopatra and her sister, Arsinoe IV, would travel to Syria to gather an invasion force that would then head to Egypt. Upon Cleopatra's return, her advance to Alexandria was blocked by her brother's forces, and so she had to camp outside Pelusium in the eastern Nile Delta. In Greece, on August 9th, 48 BCE, Caesar and Pompey were partaking in the decisive Battle of Pharsalus. This battle resulted in the destruction of the majority of Pompey's army and his forced flight to Tyre, Lebanon. Pompey's close relation with the Ptolemies made him decide to go to Egypt for refuge and to replenish his forces. The advisors of Ptolemy XIII feared this idea, and in a scheme devised by Theodotos and possibly even Pothinus, Pompey's arrival was ambushed, and on September 28th, 48 BCE, Pompey would be stabbed to death. Ptolemy XIII, in his young naivety, believed that this helped him demonstrate his power and proceeded to attempt to defuse the situation by having Pompey's severed and embalmed head sent to Caesar in early October when Caesar took up residence at the royal palace. Caesar expressed immense grief and outrage over this murder and called on Ptolemy XIII and Cleopatra to disband their forces and reconcile with one another. Ptolemy XIII did not obey Caesar's demands and would arrive to Alexandria at the head of his armies. Cleopatra, however, initially sent emissaries to Caesar, but upon hearing of his infamous affairs with royal women, decided to come to Alexandria personally to meet him. How she was able to get into the palace is a mystery. We know that she was able to do so without her brother's knowledge. Historian Cassius Dio says that she did so by dressing in an attractive manner and charming Caesar with her wit, while Plutarch alleges that she was smuggled into the palace in a bed sack. The latter's account is the most infamous story, one that has survived millennia, but regardless of how Cleopatra made it into the palace, her plan worked in her favor, and she was able to gain the upper hand by getting Caesar as her ally. Upon realization that his sister was able to consort directly with Caesar, Ptolemy attempted to rouse Alexandria's populace into a riot. Caesar, however, arrested him and proceeded to use his infamous oratorical skills to calm the frenzied crowd. Caesar would then bring out Cleopatra and Ptolemy to the assembly of Alexandria, where he revealed Ptolemy XII's written will that named Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII as co-rulers. Caesar would also attempt to make the other two siblings, Arsinoe IV and Ptolemy XIV, co-rulers of Cyprus, to remove potential rival claimants to Egypt's throne and appease the Ptolemaic subjects that were still bitter over Romans' annexation of Cyprus, which occurred in 50 BCE. Athenius, however, decided that this agreement favored Cleopatra over Ptolemy XIII and had the general Achilles lead Ptolemy's forces to Alexandria to attack Caesar and Cleopatra. This resulted in Pausanias' execution, and Arsinoe joining forces with Achilles and declaring herself queen. She would then have her tutor, Ganymedes, kill Achilles and assume the position of commander of her army. Ganymedes was able to trick Caesar into requesting Ptolemy XIII's presence as a negotiator, but Ptolemy would join Arsinoe's army. What resulted would be the siege of the royal palace, with Cleopatra and Caesar trapped inside, and would last until 47 BCE. Caesar's reinforcements would arrive sometime between January and March of 47 BCE. This resulted in both Ptolemy XIII and Arsinoe withdrawing their forces to the Nile, where Caesar would proceed to attack them. Ptolemy XIII would attempt to flee by boat, but the boat capsized, which caused Ptolemy to drown. Ganymedes is assumed to have been killed in battle, and Theodotos was found years later in Asia and executed by Marcus Junius Brutus. Caesar was incredibly wary of having a sole female monarch, and so he appointed Cleopatra's youngest brother, and now 12-year-old Ptolemy XIV, as joint ruler. However, Cleopatra and Caesar would continue to live privately. Caesar would leave Egypt for Rome sometime in April 47 BCE, and during this time he held a triumph parade. In this parade, Arsinoe would be paraded through before her exile to the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus. Cleopatra, however, was absent from these events and continued to keep residence at her royal palace in Alexandria. But what caused this absence? Well, she was pregnant with Caesar's child. Ptolemy XV Caesarion was born in 47 BCE, and while Caesar remained publicly silent about Caesarion being his son, he did acknowledge him in private. Cleopatra, however, was very vocal about Caesarion's parentage and made numerous official declarations stating that Caesar was his father. A year later, Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIV would visit Rome, assumedly without an infant cesarean, where Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIV would be awarded by Caesar as friend and ally of the Roman people. During this visit, Cleopatra would be visited by Senator Cicero, who stated that Cleopatra was arrogant. On September 25th, 46 BCE, a golden statue of Cleopatra was erected in the Temple of Venus Genetrix. This statue associated Cleopatra directly with the goddess Venus, who was the mother of Romans. It also subtly linked the goddess Isis with Roman religion. Cleopatra's presence in Rome likely affected the Lupercalia festival. At this festival, Mark Antony attempted to put a royal diadem on Caesar's head, which Caesar refused in what is considered a staged performance to gauge the Roman public's mood about accepting kingship. A month later, on the infamous Ides of March, March 15th, 44 BCE, Caesar would be assassinated. Cleopatra would stay in Rome for about a month, in the hopes of having Caesarion named as Caesar's heir. Caesar's heir, however, according to his will, was his grandnephew, Octavian. There is some suggestion that Cleopatra may have been pregnant with her and Caesar's second child during this time. However, if this was the case, it ended in the loss of the baby. A few months later, Ptolemy XIV died, allegedly by being poisoned by Cleopatra. Cleopatra would then elevate Caesarion to her co-ruler. Caesar's assassination would cause a civil war amongst Rome. The second triumvirate, founded in 43 BCE, was headed by Octavian, Antony, and Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, in which they were each elected for 5-year terms in efforts to restore order to the Republic and bring Caesar's assassins to justice. One of these assassins, Gaius Cassius Longinus, even sent a message to Cleopatra to request military aid. However, she wrote an excuse stating that she faced too many internal problems in Egypt and could not aid him, while she sent the last of Caesar's legions in Egypt to Galabella. Cassius, however, captured these troops in Palestine. The governor of Cyprus, Sarpanion, defied Cleopatra and defected to Cassius and aided him with ships. As a result, Cleopatra would take her fleet to Greece to personally aid Octavian and Antony. Her fleet, however, would be heavily damaged, and she arrived too late to aid in the fight. By autumn 42 BCE, Antony succeeded in defeating the forces of Caesar's assassins in the Battle of Philippi in Greece, which resulted in both Cassius and Brutus committing suicide. By the end of 42 BCE, Octavian controlled over half of much of the western half of Rome's republic, while Antony controlled the eastern half, and Lepidus was largely marginalized. Antony would establish his headquarters in Anatolia in the summer of 41 BCE and attempted to summon Cleopatra there. However, she rebuffed this until Quintus Dellius, Antony's envoy, convinced her to come. This meeting between Cleopatra and Antony allowed Cleopatra to clear the misconception of her support of Cassius during the Civil War and address territory exchanges in Levant. Antony, however, decided to form a romantic and personal relationship with her. Cleopatra would then sail up the Kidinos River to Tarsus and Thalamagos, and it hosted Antony and his officers for 2 nights of lavish banquets upon her ship. She managed to clear her name as a supporter of Cassius and convinced Antony to execute the exiled Arsinoe. Antony would visit Alexandria in November of 41 BCE and was well received by Alexandria's populace. While in Egypt, Antony continued to enjoy the royal lifestyle that he partook in upon Cleopatra's ship in Tarsus. During this time, Cleopatra and Antony's relationship fully started. Cleopatra was extremely careful about her romantic partnerships. And while she did need Antony, Antony needed her as well. Antony may have had powers as triumvir, but Cleopatra had a navy and resources like food and money. Antony's powers, however, meant that he had the authority to return the former lands belonging to the Ptolemaic dynasty, which were now under Roman control, to Cleopatra. Cleopatra and Antony's relationship was founded on mutual respect and admiration for one another. But there is no denying that Antony craved the riches that Cleopatra had, and she used that to her advantage. She did, however, grow to love him, and by the end of 40 BCE, while Antony was in Syria quelling rebellions caused by Cassius's former officer Quintus Lepinius, now working for the Parthian Empire, she gave birth to twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, both of whom Antony acknowledged as his children. Their names, after the sun and moon, were symbolic of a new societal rejuvenation era and indicated that Cleopatra had hoped Antony would repeat Alexander the Great's exploits and conquer Parthia. Antony's Parthian campaign was disrupted by the Perusian War, which was initiated by his ambitious wife Fulvia against Octavian in the hopes that she could make Antony undisputed leader of Rome. Fulvia and Antony's brother was besieged by Octavian at Perusia and exiled, after which Fulvia died in Greece while attempting to reach Antony. Her death led to the reconciliation between Antony and Octavian, which would then lead to Antony marrying Octavian's sister, Octavia the Younger. This marriage caused the relationship between Antony and Cleopatra to sour. It would be 3 years before Antony and Cleopatra saw or spoke to one another again, when Antony summoned Cleopatra to Antioch to discuss pressing issues. Cleopatra would bring their now 3-year-old twins with her, and this would be the first time Antony would see his children. Antony would proceed to enlarge the Ptolemaic realm by relinquishing Roman territories in efforts to reconcile his relationship with Cleopatra. This, however, was exploited by Octavian, who used the public sentiment Rome had against the empowerment of a foreign queen at the expense of the Republic to his advantage. Octavian fostered a narrative that Antony was neglecting his virtuous Roman wife Octavia for Cleopatra, and proceeded to give Octavia extraordinary privileges of sacrosanctity. He would even erect statues in the form of Caesar to rival the one of Cleopatra that Caesar erected. Meanwhile, Cleopatra was accompanying Antony on his journey to invade various empires. In 36 BCE, she accompanied him to Euphrates, but would later return to Egypt, more than likely due to her advanced state of pregnancy. In the summer of 36 BCE, Cleopatra would give birth to her 4th and final child, a son named Ptolemy Philadelphus. Antony's campaign in Parthia, however, was turning into a complete debacle. After losing an estimated 3,000 men, Antony would arrive at Leucomon, near modern-day Beirut, Lebanon, in December of 36 BCE. There, he would engage in heavy drinking before Cleopatra arrived to provide funding and clothing to his battered troops. To avoid risking returning to Rome, Antony would travel back to Alexandria with Cleopatra to see his newborn son. The rivalry between Antony, Cleopatra, and Octavian would last 6 years, with one of the final battles being the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE. This battle was a major loss for both Antony and Cleopatra, and resulted in many of their troops and officers defecting to Octavian's side when Antony and Cleopatra fled the battle. It would be in late summer of 31 BCE that Cleopatra would start to view Antony as a liability. She would start preparing to leave Egypt to Caesarion and flee to a foreign port in hopes of recuperating. These plans, however, were abandoned when Macellus I managed to burn Cleopatra's fleet as revenge for his losses in a war with Herod of Judea that Cleopatra had initiated. As a result, Cleopatra had no other options than to stay in Egypt and negotiate with Octavian, and was officially, at least mentally, defeated. According to pro-Octavian propaganda, it is believed that this is the time that Cleopatra started to test the strength of various poisons on prisoners and even her own servants. During this time of uncertainty, Cleopatra had Caesarion enter the ranks of FB in efforts to groom her son and becoming the sole ruler of Egypt. In a show of solidarity, Antony had his son with Fulvia enter the FB at the same time. Antony and Cleopatra would proceed to send separate messages to Octavian. However, Octavian seems to have only replied to Cleopatra. Cleopatra's request was that her children be allowed to inherit Egypt, while Antony be allowed to live in Egypt in exile. And she even offered Octavian money in the future and sent him lavish gifts almost immediately. Octavian would then send a diplomat to Cleopatra after she threatened to burn herself and her treasures in a tomb that was under construction. This diplomat advised Cleopatra to kill Antony so that her life would be spared. But Antony suspected foul intent and had the diplomat flogged and sent back to Octavian without a deal. In the spring of 30 BCE, Octavian set out to invade Egypt. He first stopped at Ptolemais in Phoenicia to meet with Herod, his new ally, and replenish supplies. He would then move swiftly and defeat Antony's forces near Arretium, and then advance quickly towards Alexandria. While Antony did win a small victory over Octavian's tired troops outside Alexandria's Hippodrome, his navy fleet would surrender to Octavian on August 1st, 30 BCE. Cleopatra had been hidden in her tomb with her close attendants and sent a message to Antony that she committed suicide. In response, Antony stabbed himself in the stomach and took his own life at the age of 53. Plutarch states that as he was dying, Antony was brought to Cleopatra in her tomb and told her that he died honorably. Proclurius, the companion of Octavian, was able to infiltrate Cleopatra's tomb and detain her, which denied her ability to burn herself and her treasures. Cleopatra, however, was allowed to embalm and bury Antony in her tomb before she was escorted to her palace. Upon Octavian's arrival in Alexandria and his seizing of the royal palace, he also seized Cleopatra's youngest children. According to Roman historian Livy, upon Cleopatra's meeting with Octavian, she told him, "I will not be led in a triumph." Octavian proceeded to keep her alive, but gave her no explanation about his future plans for her kingdom. A spy, however, told Cleopatra that Octavian planned to move her and her children to Rome in 3 days, and she then proceeded to plan her suicide to avoid being paraded like her sister did. Cleopatra's place of death on August 12th, 30 BCE is uncertain, but it is said that she was accompanied by her servants, who also took their own lives. Although angered by this outcome, Octavian had Cleopatra buried in royal fashion next to Antony in her tomb. Her cause of death is uncertain, but it is believed that she allowed an Egyptian cobra to bite or poison her. In her last moments, she sent her beloved Caesarion to Upper Egypt. However, the now Ptolemy XV would only live 18 days until Octavian ordered his execution on August 29th, 30 BCE. Caesarion's execution was advised by the philosopher Arius Didymus, who is said to have told Octavian that there was only room for one Caesar in the world. Cleopatra and Antony's children would be sent to live with their stepmother, Octavia. All 3 children were present in Octavian's Roman triumph in 29 BCE, but after this point, the fates of Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus are unknown. It is believed Octavian had the boys murdered, but we will truly never know what happened to them. Cleopatra's only surviving heir would be her daughter, Cleopatra Selene. Cleopatra Selene would be married to Juba II in 25 BCE and would go on to import many important scholars, artists, and advisors from her mother's court in Alexandria to serve her. She would also name her son Ptolemy in honor of her Ptolemaic dynastic heritage. Unfortunately, Ptolemy of Mauretania would be executed by Roman Emperor Caligula in 40 AD. Ptolemy would be the last known monarch of the Ptolemaic dynasty. However, Queen Zenobia of the short-lived Palmyrean Empire claimed to be a descendant of Cleopatra. And with Ptolemy of Mauretania's execution, the Ptolemaic line died. Cleopatra VII's legacy has been plagued with the myths created by Octavian and efforts to slander her. I am once again joined by my former teacher, Mr. K, to discuss some of these myths and controversies, some theories surrounding her death, and even cover the impact that Egypt would have over Rome after its annexation. Brings us to our next question of her affairs with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony are infamous. While many scholars believe she used these affairs in order to make Egypt an independent state, there are others who believe that she was trying to influence Roman politics. Which is more likely to be the case?
Ooh, that's a tough one, because I would say Cleopatra, no matter what historians tell us about her, and of course, Roman being the writers of the history were disparaging. She was an absolute brilliant politician, a brilliant leader. She was so smart that I think both of them could have been her motives at the same time. She could both see that she needed their help, but she could also say, you know what, I'm smart enough that I can influence how Egypt and Rome work with each other rather than Rome just taking over.
Yeah, and an excellent example of that is, I know when it came to her relationship with Mark Antony was the one who was more reliant on her because
Absolutely.
of the fact that he needed her money, her warriors, her ships,
Yes.
everything, because he wanted that initial control of Rome. And of course, Octavian, being the quote unquote rightful heir, was like, no, this is mine.
Yeah.
And so
was,
the new civil war
it was
happened.
it was actually that relationship between Mark Antony and Cleopatra that turned Rome against Egypt, because they felt, and of course Octavian did the propaganda and made it sound like they were wanting to take over Rome. Whether that's the case or not can be debated, but the relationship with Julius Caesar and Cleopatra didn't sit well with the populace of Rome, but it wasn't the absolute hatred of Egypt until, of course, Caesar was murdered and Mark Antony and Cleopatra got together and Octavian started his propaganda machine, is when it really started turning against Egypt.
Yeah, definitely. I remember my own research going through and saying that Octavian was even saying, oh, well, she was using Mark Antony and she wants to go through and she wants to, you know, become goddess of Rome and become quote unquote the sole ruler of the world. And it's like, but that's I personally, I do think she was trying to make it an independent state again, but I do also think that she could have gone through and she could have used that. It's like, hey, we both need each other. We could go through and we can work together, which is evident with, of course, she was trying to go through, and once Mark Antony died, she was even trying to go through and kind of, hey, Octavian, I can work with you too. Like, we can work together. And Octavian wasn't having any of it.
No, he had none of it.
He's like, you've sullied Rome to pieces, basically. Which goes into when he invaded in 30 BCE and would later conquer in that same year after Cleopatra's death. How did this impact not only Egypt's economy, but Rome's economy as well? And did Egyptian art and architecture end up influencing Roman art and architecture?
Absolutely. Basically, it skyrocketed Rome to prominence. They now had the wealth of Egypt, which, because Octavian, soon to be Augustus, made Egypt not just a partner, but an actual province of Rome. All their wealth, all their foodstuffs, everything now belonged to Rome. So it wasn't up to the Egyptians to trade with whoever. It was Rome's, and that's the way it was. Once Augustus became emperor, his, I wouldn't say passion, but his tolerance of everything Egypt started to change. And the nobility of Rome started getting really interested in the culture of Egypt, their artwork. In fact, you'll find many Roman temples that have incorporated Egyptian motifs, architecture, things in theirs. In fact, they even adopted, if you will, the goddess Isis into the Roman pantheon.
And I know that they also, there's evidence of like Roman mummies and like ancient
Yes.
Alexandria as it was. So Rome definitely, after the sulliness that Octavian kind of had, kind of died off. It kind of helped kind of pave the way
Yes.
for the
Yes.
Roman and
Rome,
Egyptian.
you could say that Rome conquered Egypt economically, but you could also say that Egypt conquered Rome when it came to culture.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And it also kind of paves into how, when it comes to, of course, when he finally conquered Egypt and he brought Cleopatra and Mark Antony's children over, um,
Yes.
he even went through, and of course, we don't know what happened to the boys. I fully believe that they were murdered as per
Well, of course they were.
tradition of like, hey, this is the heir. We gotta get rid of the heir.
Yes.
But he had their daughter married off to a Roman
The Roman
subsidy, and it was helped build that relationship. Even so, Egypt
and
definitely has more of an impact on Rome than I think Octavian would like to admit.
I believe so. Well, and of course you're forgetting that Cleopatra and Julius Caesar
Oh yeah,
had a son, and his fate under Augustus.
oh yeah. Caesarion ended up getting the cook too. It was
Yes, he
not. It
did.
was. See, that's one of the, when I go through and everyone's like, "Oh, well, Cleopatra did this, this, and this." I'm like, but you have to remember, she was looking forward to her children's future. She
Oh,
made
absolutely.
sure that her son was sent off to be safe because, like, this is my heir. I need to send my
Right.
heir off.
Yep. She fully
And
intended for him to be pharaoh.
she fully intended on all of her children to kind of follow in her footsteps. And because of her relationship with Rome, all of her male heirs ended up getting killed off. And
Right.
so everyone's like, "Oh, well, she went through and she committed suicide." I'm like, "Well, if she did, I don't think she would have done it like that, because I feel like she would have done it in more grander schemes of whatever." But everyone is also just like, "Well, she didn't want to get captured." I'm like, "No, she didn't want to get captured, but
Oh, yeah,
she was
she would have been
also
taken
too
back to
proud."
Roman chain, but
She was also, given what we, of course, we won't ever know, but given what we know about her pride, I don't feel like she would have given up that easily. But at the same time,
she was out
out
of
of
resource.
resources, out of what she could have done. So it's one of those we'll
Yeah.
never know. And there's always that major theory of, "Oh, well, we could look at her mummy." It's like, but y'all ain't gonna find her mummy.
Well,
They're
I
trying to, and that's and it
have you
brings
been
back
keeping up?
into the conversations that we used to have of, "Oh, well, where's Cleopatra?" And I would always go through and be like, "She's not there. I know she's not there." And I would even tell my mom, I was like, "She's not there." And my mom's like, "How do you know?" I'm like, "Because that's not where Alexandria is. Alexandria is in the sea." And lo and behold, look what happens. It's in the sea.
Have you been keeping up though? I wish I could remember the archaeologist's name.
Dr. Kathleen Martinez, and
Yes,
they were looking at Temple of Osiris magma
correct.
that was kind of in Alexandria. And when they had gone through, in the last update I saw was that all points were looking kind of along the shoreline of where ancient Alexandria would be. And I was like, if I
Well,
had have had the smarts.
actually, a new update. They have found the ancient harbor,
Mm-hmm.
and they have found a tunnel
Mm-hmm.
that leads to the temple.
Mm-hmm.
And so the theory right now, of course, because they still haven't found them, but the theory is that when they brought her body to the temple, they used that tunnel. So they got her on a boat, got her into that harbor, and snuck her body to the temple through that tunnel.
Which would actually make sense, because I know that she was very adamant about Octavian not getting access to her.
Yes.
Incredibly adamant. She was even trying to go through and make sure that he didn't get access to Antony, but of course, given that Antony was Roman, it's kind of a little bit more difficult, because Roman had their own funerary practices and whatnot. So, but that's just incredibly. I've been trying to keep an eye, but it changes so much.
Oh yes, yeah, I can definitely keep an eye on it. All I say is I hope I'm alive if they find her.
Oh yes, I am in that same mindset. Of like, if they find her, I cannot wait, and I'm so glad that it's somebody who's taking it with as much stride as Dr. Martinez is, because she's going through, and apparently, from what I heard, that she's not an Egyptologist. She's like a lawyer, like a
That's
criminal
correct.
case lawyer. So she's going through and
Yes.
she's treating Cleopatra like she's like a murder victim
Yes.
or whatever. And it's like, that's the way, that's an amazing way to go through and kind of treat finding somebody who's been mysteriously missing for so long. But I've even gone through and like I've talked to my husband about it. It's like, technically speaking, like all of the Ptolemaic dynasty mummies are gone. So it's going to be
It'd be incredible.
It'd be
Absolutely
incredibly.
incredible.
It'd be such an immense part of history that would be just, the gates would be open.
It eclipsed King Tut's discovery.
Oh yes, it would definitely. And even then, with King Tut, it's just like you'd be surprised how much could be found. Just, if I know that like we can't recover much because it's been under the sea for so long, but we'd still be able to use that resource and kind of piece together more about her history, because while we know a lot about her, we don't know,
That's right. So much
because
has been
Rome
lost.
painted her as
Yep.
this seductress, and she was quite the opposite. If Dr. Kathleen Martinez does find Cleopatra's tomb, it truly will rival Tutankhamun's tomb's discovery. A woman whose legacy has influenced modern media and been portrayed by the enigmatic Elizabeth Taylor will have the chance to be repainted in a light that she truly deserves. It would pave the way for a new era of archaeology and unlock so many secrets that ancient Alexandria has hidden in its sea-sunken harbor. Whether Cleopatra was murdered or committed suicide, we may never know. But we do know that the legacy she left behind is one rivaling other famous queens like Anne Boleyn and Marie Antoinette. Her legacy has been told by her Roman rivals, painted as a seductress who wanted Rome and its power to herself. However, she was the opposite. She was a queen who wanted Egypt to be independent again. She was a loving mother who hoped for her children to continue the legacy that ran in their DNA. A woman whose knowledge and intelligence made her the only Ptolemaic pharaoh able to converse with all her subjects, not just the Greek-speaking ones. She was Cleopatra VII, Thea Philopator, last of Alexander the Great's successors. She had continued her father's trade with India and grew Egypt's economy. Cleopatra VII deserves to have her true legacy remembered, not the one Octavian and his historians painted for her. Until next season, Remember to follow the podcast's Facebook and Blue Sky pages for all updates regarding when the next season will premiere and what it will be about. Also, remember that you are loved. And like Cleopatra, you deserve to fight for your independence. Until next time, may the goddess Isis protect you.